Good morning. This is the Lord's Day, and I trust that we're all here with one purpose in mind, and that is to worship Jehovah God as He has commanded us to do. Very happy to be able here this morning to worship God with you. It's been quite some time since we have had the privilege of being here to worship with you, and we're happy to be here today. And since we have worshiped with you, there's been some good things happen, and there have been some things that are not so good have happened. As in life, as we go through life, good things happen to us, and also some things that are not so good. Many of you know that my grandson, Madison, several years ago, suffered leukemia. And he was very sick during that time. About that time, a man that I worked with lost his wife to cancer. And I guess she suffered greatly. And we talked about these things sometimes, and he said, if there is a God, why does He let things like this happen? And people down through the ages of time have wondered why good things, or why bad things happen to good people. And I'm not smart enough to answer all of those questions, but my daughter-in-law, as she has in raising her family, she had 3 children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. And as the kids would be, sometimes would say in their life, well, that's not fair. That's not fair to do this, or that's not fair that happened to me. And she would tell them that life is not fair, a lesson that we all need to learn. And I hope this morning this lesson that I've prepared will help us all realize that life is not fair. I'd like to read, for my lesson, I'd like to read the 39th chapter of Genesis. If you have your Bibles, and turn with us while we read Genesis 39. It says, "And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, and Egyptian, taught him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass from the times that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessings of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had to Joseph's hand, and he knew not he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master was not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. And how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass as he spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie with her or to be with her. And it came to pass about the time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand, and fled, and got him out. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in a Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me, and fled, and got him out. And she laid up his garments by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him, accusing him to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me, and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him, and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. I think this morning that we can learn many lessons from this chapter. And I think the first lesson that we need to learn is that God has a master plan. He has a reason for telling us to do the things that he does. He has a reason for doing the things that he does, and a reason for doing the things the way that he does. God has a master plan, and things are going to be done according to his plan, and he doesn't need any help from mankind to accomplish his goals. He doesn't need us getting involved in politics, in voting, getting into big arguments of who is the best person for the office, or which political party is the best for his cause, or getting involved in protest marches, or taking matters into our own hands and repaying evil for evil. Romans, the 12th chapter, in the 19th verse records, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." And the Apostle Paul, writing to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, pens, "I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayer, intercession, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all goodliness and honesty. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior." And I think that we might, this is a good example of this, is our stand on carnal warfare. We don't protest carnal warfare by protest marches, by burning draft cards, or by burning our flag. We just try to live a quiet and a peaceful life, do what those in authority would require us to do, like register as a conscientious objector, and work in a hospital or other community service. And we see here from this chapter that Joseph tried to live a life like this. He tried to live a quiet and a peaceful life, as we read in verses 1 through 6. But the second lesson I think that we can learn from this chapter is that life is not fair. Just because we try to live a quiet and a peaceful life doesn't necessarily mean that we won't have problems, that we won't have trials, that we won't have tribulations, we won't have persecutions, and things won't happen in our lives that we don't understand. In fact, the scriptures teach just the opposite of this fact. 2 Timothy 3:12 records, "Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." And we see this is exactly what happened here to Joseph. Through no fault of his own, he was treated, first of all, he was treated unfairly by his father Jacob. If we go back to chapter 37 of verse 3, it tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his children, and showed it by giving him the coat of many colors. I think we can all relate to the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors that we read as children, or maybe we read to our children, to our grandchildren. But when Jacob gave Joseph this coat of many colors, it caused in chapter 4, verse 4 of the same chapter, it caused problems. It caused jealousy, hatred, and animosity among his other sons. So Jacob, the father, must share part of the blame for his son Joseph being where he is now. We know that fathers who show partiality among their children do them no favor. As a matter of fact, they do them wrong. And parents who don't teach their children responsibility, who don't tell them that life is not always fair and how to deal with it, do them no favors. No, there's a sign in our shop at Ford, in our maintenance shop at Ford, and it says, "Your mother doesn't work here. If you make a mess, clean it up." As parents and as grandparents and leaders in the church, it is our responsibility to teach our children and the dignity of work and their responsibility to the home, to God, to the church, and to the community, and to the world. Not long ago, I was listening to a radio program, and this DJ, for some reason, was interviewing this lady and happened to ask her what she did. And she said, "Well, I'm just a housewife." And the DJ answered, "You talk like that's not a very important job." He said, "I think that is one of the most important jobs that a woman can do." And I will agree, not only with the disc jockey, and I was kind of surprised to hear him say that, but I agree with what he said, and I agree with the bumper sticker that I saw the other day that said that motherhood is an honorable profession. Something I think that the world has almost forgotten, and sadly enough, I'm afraid some in the church as well. You know, Proverbs 22:6 says, some people in their children, when they are teaching, and sometimes their children, sometimes children get into problems at school, well, it's not their children's fault, it's always the other children's fault. And it's always the, if they flunk out in school, it's not their children's fault, it's the teacher's fault. And if they're not members of the church, it's the preacher's fault, or the leader's fault, or some other members in the church's fault. It's not their fault for not having taught their children what is right. Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." And Ephesians 6:4 commands, "And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and in the admonition of the Lord." Teach your children. I think we can learn a lesson from this, to teach your children that life is not fair. But if they serve God, He will bless them in this life and bless them more eternally. Psalms 143:7 reads, "He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds." And another lesson I think that we can learn from this chapter is that when life hands you a lemon, make lemonade. Joseph was not treated fairly by his father. He was badly mistreated by his brothers, who hated him so much that they almost killed him, but decided instead that they would sell him into slavery, as we read in verse 1. We see here Joseph is a slave in a foreign land, away from his father, his family, and as far as he knew that he would never see them again. He could have become bitter and reasoned, "God, I tried to serve you. I tried to do what's right. And look what happened to me. Look what I get for my efforts of trying to live a quiet and a peaceful life. I think I'll just throw up my hands, throw in the towel, and quit." But we see not Joseph. He was a person of integrity. Here we see his sterling character. He just went about doing his business of leading a quiet and peaceful life, doing what he knew was right, and God blessed him for it. And I believe that God will do the same for us today. If we just go about living a quiet and peaceful life and doing the things that He commands us to do. I think maybe a question that we could ask ourselves is, one of the problems in the world today, in the world and in the church, could it be today because we will all want to be chiefs and not enough people want to be Indians? We need to live a quiet and a peaceful life, and God will bless us. And another lesson I think that we can learn from this chapter, and that we can say no to temptation if we purpose in our heart to do so. We may use the excuse that the temptation was just too great. The temptation was just too great, and I yielded to temptation and did wrong. It was just too great for me to overcome. But God promises in 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter and the 13th verse, "There hath no temptation taken you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able. But with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it." God doesn't always say that it will be easy, but we can overcome temptation and remain faithful to God if we make up our mind to do so, and like Joseph say, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? You know, there's a saying that we hear many times that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And Potiphar's wife was scorned, and she was going to make Joseph pay for it. As we can read in the 10th chapter in verse 10 through 19. I'd like to turn and read that again. 10 through 19 it says, And it came to pass that she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie with her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in the Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord come home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, and his wrath was kindled. You know, we might ask ourselves, is how would you like to be in Joseph's shoes at this time? Here was a woman who accused him, unjustly accused him of attacking her. There was no other witnesses. She had cried out for help, fought him off, and as he was fleeing, she managed to grab a part of his garment, and here it is. Here's the proof. And all the defense that you had was, I'm not guilty. I didn't do it. It was all her idea. How many people are going to believe you? It looked pretty bad for Joseph at this point. It looked so bad that he was an innocent. It looked so bad that an innocent man was put in prison. Truly, Joseph was in a pretty bad spot. The only satisfaction that he had was knowing that he was innocent and knowing that God knew that he was not guilty. And you know, many times in life, things may look pretty bad for us. Things might happen, and you know, it looks like everything's going the wrong way, but we can have the satisfaction, if we remain faithful to God, we have the satisfaction that knowing that he's on our side and that he knows that we are innocent. And I think from this chapter, or from this, another lesson we can learn from this chapter is that things are not always what they seem. They're not always the way that other people look at us, and they're not always the same. And many times the things that we hear that we know about others is not always the truth. I worked with a man that by the name of John McAfee. I knew this man. We worked together for some 40 years. And he went home from work one day a little early, and his wife was washing windows upstairs. And they lived in a tri-level house, and his wife was on the second floor washing windows. And he asked her, he said, do you need any help? And she said, no, I'm just about finished. But she said, I would like to finish before I cook dinner. He said, he'd had some back problems, and he said, well, if you don't need any help, I'm going in and lay down on the couch. And he did, and he went to sleep. And something happened, and his wife fell out of the second story window and broke her vertebrae in her back and did some other damage, and she passed out, and she lay there for quite some time. And when she fell behind some bushes, and it was hard for people to see her, you know. And as she fell, she remembered crying out for help, but nobody heard her. So she laid there for some time until their neighbor was walking his dog and happened to see her. And as he happened to see her there, and he called the paramedics, and here come the paramedics, and here come the police. Well, they began to ask her what the situation was and what happened, you know. And so John had just woke up, and he told him the story. He didn't know for sure exactly what happened, you know. And so then they asked him, they said, is this your hunting knife? Is this your knife? And he said, yes. I said, that's my hunting knife. And he said, how did it get down there with your wife? And he said, well, I'm not for sure. So what happened was they began to suspect him of pushing her out the window. And so the police told him, you know, they suspected that they was having a domestic fight, and he pushed her out the window, you know, and was trying to act like he was innocent. And so they said, well, we're left with the impression that they were going to question him some more, because they said, don't leave town. You know, well, he wasn't going anywhere, you know. So after they took his wife to the hospital and doctor. After she came to, the police questioned her, and she told them what happened. She's not sure what happened, but she leaned out too far or something, and she fell. And so they even went so far as to tell her, don't be afraid to testify against your husband. Said if he tried to kill you, said just tell us the truth and we'll protect you. And she said, well, that's not what happened at all. Said I fell out of the window on my own. Well, they didn't believe her, and but he said, you know, he said if my wife had died, he said, there's not a doubt in my mind that I would have been tried for murder. He said, even today, when I go to town and I see the Independence police see me, he said, they always look at me like I put something over on them. And you know, things are not always what they seem, even if we think that we know all of the facts. And another story was about a member of the church. Some of you may have known him or heard him by the name of Brother Virgil Hoagland. And he was driving along the street one day, and the car in front of him stopped at the stoplight. And he pulled up behind the car in the stoplight, and this happened to be a young girl in the car. And while they were sitting there waiting for the light to change, somehow she got her car in reverse. And when the light changed, she started up and she came backward into his car, damaged his car, and they got out and they called the police. The policeman came, looked the situation over, pulled out his ticket book and started writing Brother Virgil a ticket. And, you know, he told him, he said, well, when you hit somebody from behind, that's always, you know, your fault. And the little girl said, no, she said, that's not the way it happened at all. She said, it was my fault. I had my car in reverse and backed into it. Well, the policeman looked a little bumfuzzled, and he kind of scratched his head and started writing out then the citation for her. And so, see, it's not always, even though we always think that we have the facts, things are not always what they seem. We need to be careful before we accuse, or before we pass judgment, or before we pass along some juicy bit of gossip, because Jesus in Matthew 7th chapter, verses 1 and 2 says, judge not, that ye be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure you might, it shall be measured to you again. And everything, you know, that we hear, everything that we think that we know for sure, before we pass it on, we should give it the Ephesians 4 and 8 test, where it says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. You know, if we would just give everything that we hear this test, and if it passes every test, then pass it on. But if it fails even one, forget it and don't pass it on. Because again, we see Jesus' own words in Luke the 6th chapter, verses 36 and 37. It says, be ye therefore merciful, as your Father also is merciful. Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. And when I was in high school, I read a book called Backfield. And you might have heard of it. I know that was a long time ago, but you might have heard of a book called Backfield. And in this story was about a football player in high school, and he was one night he had forgotten some of his homework. When he went back to get it, the janitor saw him and let him in. And then sometime that night, somebody broke into the school and stole one of the trophies. And naturally, he was a suspect. And they never proved that he was guilty, or they really never proved that he wasn't guilty. And so this bothered this young man, and he told his father, he said, well, people will always suspect me of doing something wrong. And his father sat down and tried to reason with him, and he said, he said, son, that will happen for a while, but if you live a good life, and he said, you set a good example, and if people see that you are doing what is right, he said, only those who choose to believe bad things will believe that you are guilty. The others will judge you by your conduct and to know that you are doing what is right. And this should be, sometimes maybe we are accused of doing something wrong, or we're in a bad situation. If we just continue to live a quiet and a peaceful life, then God will bless us for it. And apparently, this is what happened to Joseph. As a matter of fact, we know from other scriptures that this is exactly what happened to Joseph. Because in verse 21 through 23 it says, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison commended to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And from these verses, it tells us that he was put in prison because of the false accusation of Potiphar's wife. Even though he was put in, he continued to live a quiet and peaceful life, and the Lord, it says, was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper, and Joseph was put in a position to carry out God's plan and to help his people, the Israelites. We see that life is not fair, but if we remain faithful and true to God, all things in the end will be righty. We are promised in the first 4 chapters of the 21st chapter of Revelations. It says, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared for a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And if we, from the scriptures, we know that things in this life are not always what they seem. Life is not fair, but God knows the very thoughts and intents of our heart. If we remain faithful to him and do what he tells us to do, then he will right all wrongs, and we will be able to have a home in heaven with him and the saints of all the ages. As we think about this chapter here, we find one last thought. I wonder what happened to Potiphar's wife in all of this. Did she get away scot-free with all of the bad things that she did? Did Potiphar ever find out the truth about the truth of the matter, that his wife was lying? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us, but I doubt if she got away scot-free. Potiphar might never have found out. Even if he never found out the truth, I would venture to say that his wife never spent a day wondering, is today the day that I will be found out? Is today the day that Potiphar will find that I was lying? But regardless of Potiphar or anyone else ever found out about his wife, Hebrews 9:27 says, and it is appointed unto man once to die, but after this, the judgment. The final lesson that I think that we can learn is that we may be able to fool everyone in this life. We may be able to fool the authorities, we may be able to fool our parents, we may be able to fool our mate, but one thing is, we can't fool God. Someday we're all going to stand before God and to give an account for the way that we have lived in this life. This morning, if you are not prepared to stand before God in judgment, you have the opportunity to do so by becoming a member of the church, by after hearing the word, believe it, repenting of your past sins, confess the sweet name of Jesus, being buried with him in baptism, rising to walk in newness of life. Or you're here this morning with sin in your life, you can't hide it from God. You need to confess that sin and have the prayers of the church to be in his good graces once more. There's one of either class we come at this time where you have time and opportunity.